Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to June on the Range. Now in its third year, I think, on BookTube, an event created by Michael K. Vaughan designed to celebrate the Western novel, once the king of the bookstore. Since it was the king of the bookstore, there have been thousands and thousands and thousands of these things printed. They usually came out as cheap 25-cent, 35-cent paperbacks. A lot of them came out as cheap hardcovers. They would do really well. Their authors, they drew authors from far and near because it was a going concern. If you wrote a Western and it was halfway good, you'd get a readership. Your book would get reprinted. So there were thousands of these things that were written, sent to bookstores, read, and then tossed on the midden heap. Amazing that how so many of them survive. But they do. They flooded the bookstores. So lots and lots of them survive. I've been building a small collection of them all year long in anticipation of June on the Range. And I read another one last night. This is by William McLeod Rain, who has an interesting story on his own. I don't know if he's ever had a biography, but he has an interesting story on his own. And this is a book from 1935 that was, in its time, reprinted endlessly. People loved it. It's called Border Breed. And I originally grabbed this paperback from the Brattle, not only because it's an old pocket book, which means it's really going to hold together well. It's really not going to fall apart. These pocket books never do. They were really made well. But also because I thought it was fascinating that the main character there is up to his chin in water. To put it mildly, our main heroes in most Western novels are strangers to bathing water. They do not go down to the stream to perform their ablutions. They're high living and low down. But there is no bathing in this book. I should point out. This is the story of a heroic young man named Dan Clifford. He is dashing, he is handsome, he is young, he is able-bodied, he is a gunsmith, and has a talent for the brave bravado gesture. And believe it takes place in a town named Los Pinos, and believe it or not, it's about salt. It's about salt flats, salt lakes, as they're called in this book. This was written in 1935, so we're gonna talk about that. Some of the terminology is a little bit odd. I don't know if there's a difference between a salt lake and a salt flat, but Dan Clifford and his men have been prospecting on a salt lake, and they have brought back to Los Pinos a wagon load of salt, which of course is a valuable commodity. The salt lakes have from time immemorial been open to anyone. They aren't owned by anyone. You're not trespassing in order to harvest salt from them. But when Dan Clifford gets back to Los Pinos, he learns that is no longer true. A man named Zach Black, a bad guy named Zach Black, says that the salt lakes are his, and that what Dan Clifford has been doing all this time out there with his men and his wagons and his prospecting crew has been thievery. And that the law, you go to the sheriff, go to the judge, the law will back me up. The law says that I have a right to this. Dan Clifford is not happy with this. He is told that the salt is not his. And so one of the bravura gestures that he makes in the town, that makes him a hero to the town loves him. Absolutely loves him. The town is full of an evil cadre of gamblers. He faces them down on the main street, on the main thoroughfare, as Deadwood would say. Faces them down on the main thoroughfare. And the whole town is watching. And they dare not do anything. And that makes him a hero. And another gesture that makes him a hero is when he goes back to his men and says, well, we're not doing business. Sorry that I'm wasting your time. I'm out money. You're out money. We're not doing business here. Dump the salt in the street. And the sheriff's emissary comes to him and says, what are you doing? You can't do that. And he says, oh, you just told me the salt's not mine. The wagons are mine. So I'm dumping the salt in the street, and you can just fish it out of the mud if you want it. And the whole town is loving this, with the exception of Zach Black, and also with the exception of another gun-toting bravo named Jasper Ford. Dan Clifford and Jasper Ford do not like each other. Zach Black might be a bad guy, an evil, sniveling bad guy, but Jasper Ford and Dan Clifford are opposing forces. They are equally opposing forces. And their antagonism builds throughout the book. At the halfway point of the book, I think a little bit more than the halfway point of the book, Dan Clifford is told by the lady love, the peaceful, gentle schoolmarm who will be his lady love, he is told that the children in school and in the town in Los Pinos routinely now play act as either Dan Clifford or Jasper Fforde. They make like they're drawing guns. I'll be Dan Clifford, you be Jasper Fforde. So their rivalry is known, and any reader of a Western novel knows how that's going to end. And it does. It gets there. But it takes a lot of twists and turns to get there, and those twists and turns wore on my patience after a while. There is a story here about those salt flats and about all the conflicting interests involved in wanting to commodify the ancient West, the Old West. But really, this book ends up feeling like the continued adventures of Dan Clifford. Really, it ends up feeling like it's just a comic book with him as the hero. It's not bad for all that. MacLeod Rain can write. It's a dreamy kind of Ivanhoe type writing, very much a Prince Valiant type writing. It's a little bit before Prince Valiant's time, but that was in the air, that kind of syrupy sentimentality where your hero is pure and speaks like a character out of Sir Walter Scott. In fact, Sir Walter Scott his name is invoked several times in this book in many different contexts, sometimes explicitly and sometimes not. So I don't think that's a stretch to say that was William MacLeod Rain's influence, or one of them. Dan Clifford could have stepped out of a 19th century romance novel. That's what he feels like throughout the book. You know that he is never going to be seriously inconvenienced. You know that he's not going to die. You know that he's going to prevail over his enemies. I knew from pretty much the halfway point of the book the fate of Jasper Fforde. What I didn't know was the fate of that salt. Believe it or not, I was interested. The fate of that salt claim. What's going on there? I mean, Dan Clifford tells Zach Black that the native people and the Mexicans and the civilians all around have always viewed them as open terrain. Not anybody's private property, not anything that you could buy or sell. So, and yet we know that, I don't think that you could go to a salt flat today and prospect. I'm pretty sure that you couldn't do that. That someone would say, no, you're trespassing, you're in violation of all kinds of laws. Probably they wouldn't be privately owned. I don't know. I didn't look into it as a result of this book, but I thought that was fascinating, and that actually does have a resolution. Unfortunately, the resolution to that plot line, the resolution to the Zach Black plot line, and the resolution to the tacked-on, lately realized romance plotline are all very pat. I know that I read William MacLeod Rain last time for June on the Range, maybe the time before that. To me, a little, the names of these Western writers still blur together, so I'm not sure if he disappointed me the last time I read him. He disappointed me in this book. It is enjoyable. It's definitely a page-turner, and I loved how the pocketbook held up. I mean, this is this is not falling apart at all. This could easily take 10 more reads. I don't know that I'll read it again. I'm not sure that I will. I want to read you a bit of something that happens regularly in the course of this book. I want to see if I can find it. There is there's a refrain. There's a narrative gimmick that Rain does a lot. In this book, and I think in the other books that I've read by him, I think he does it a lot, that he hits this refrain a lot because it probably happened to him. It probably saw it in himself. And that is the real young man hidden under the exterior of something that doesn't look real. And the real young man will always be the same thing. He will always be a dude bro. He'll be capable of physical violence. He will be largely thoughtless. He won't reflect on anything. He certainly won't care about anything. He'll be, if not a dude bro, then certainly a dude, to use the terminology of the 19th century West. And we get that a lot. We get a number of moments like that in this book. This one is Dan had taken a contract for the delivery of 40,000 feet of lumber to a contractor who was putting up a store building. He had just finished unloading a wagon when he looked up to see the Reverend Philip Washburn coming across the street to him. The road was muddy, but there was nothing finical about the way the clergyman moved. He avoided the worst of the mud, yet picked a passage without hesitation. You are Mr. Clifford? The minister asked. Yes, sir. Dan got down from the bed of the wagon. Washburn is my name. The churchman extended a hand. Dan liked the firm grip. He liked it that the other had not hesitated because his brown palm was soiled with brick dust. Philip Washburn was a well-set-up young man just out of the theological seminary. He had first-class family connections in the East, but had preferred to go to the frontier as a home missionary during the earlier year of his work. It was his opinion that existence had been made too easy for him. What he needed was contact with life in the raw. That was why he had come to Los Pinos rather than accept a pastorate in a church well padded from the knocks of harsh reality. To put it mildly, in his own life, William McLeod Rain experienced something like that, and that crops up a lot in his books. So I was expecting it, and it didn't really derail the reading experience for me. The main thing that derailed the reading experience in this book for me was that if it's going to be The Adventures of Dan Clifford, I'm okay with that. But Dan Clifford should be more interesting, if that's going to be true, and he isn't. He's largely a jawbone. he's largely hair under the hat and whatnot. Constantly, either explicitly or implicitly, giving people that the old, standard, boring, mafioso masculinity test. Are you a real man or are you not? There's only going to be one standard. It's going to be mine. And I'm going to do that all the time. I'm going to do that to literally everybody all the time. But there was a thing in this that did bother me. And we've brought it up before. Fortunately, I have, like I always say, I have fallen in with the right crowd on book 2. A crowd that can enjoy things even while not granting them a free pass. A crowd that spurns bandwagon jumping. A crowd that admittedly has resisted the number one diktat of book 2, which is that Steve is always right. There are quite a few holdouts among you. I don't know what that's all about. But in this crowd, I have brought up the fact we have talked about. Michael K. Vaughan made a great video on the subject of the drawbacks of some of these novels, a lot of these novels. The sexism, of course, like I mentioned, the women are Cupid dolls. They're prizes to be won. They almost never have any three-dimensionality of their own as characters. Sometimes that's not true. I got a couple of emails in the last couple of days from some of you who have heard me and Michael K. Vaughan talking about something like this and said, I've read some that were like that. That's wonderful. And of course, any Western novel written after the late 1980s will have that anyway. They are still written, and they won't be like that. They won't be like this. And we mentioned gun violence. There's very little in the way of gun violence here. Despite the games that those children play, the gun violence is saved for the climax. There's very little of that. It's implied, but there's not a lot of it throughout the rest of the book. But another thing that we mentioned was racism. And we've had some good. I have in my emails. I've had some very good discussions about racism, and that's great. I want to continue that. And by and large, we have largely agreed that there are two kinds, right? There are two strains of racism. Are you imbibing, unthinkingly, the bigotries of your time and reflecting them in your conversation and in your prose? That's not good, but it's not actively evil. It's certainly completely different than you being an active bigot, someone who actively does embrace this stuff. You know the bigotries that you have, and you embrace them. You want to hold them. You wish other people held them, and you want to act on them. Those are two drastically different things. I think we can agree. And those in the groundwater bigotries of the time are the kind of thing that we should forgive in the Westerns that we're reading in June on the Range, I think. I think forgiving them, there's no point in railing against them. If the person who was writing the book was open-handed and trusted everyone according to their deeds and their character rather than their appearance, and a lot of these old Western salts, these guys that were writing Westerns, were that way. They were good, sterling, stand-up guys. If that person is that way and is just writing in the lingo of the genre, then we should largely ignore it. Notice it, but don't let it ruin the reading experience. Certainly don't let it bar the reading experience. Don't say, I'm not going to read that, because it's only the other kind, that the active kind, that is much harder to ignore, and I would say there's much less of a justification for ignoring it. And a couple of times in this book, William McLeod Rain approaches the dividing line between those two, in ways that I mean, I'm not hypersensitive to this sort of thing. I hate, in fact, the hypersensitivity that now rules large parts of the 21st century, all of academia, all of Hollywood. I hate a lot of the performative oversensitivity to this stuff. So I'm not oversensitive to it myself. My gauge is fairly normally set. But even so, not so much the Mexicans and not so much Native Americans in this book as the Chinamen. There's a main character in this book, an evil, scheming Chinaman. Rain refers to him a number of times as a son of Confucius. Oh, and worst of all, his name. His name is Ah Sin. A-H space S-I-N. Just in case you were wondering if William MacLeod Rain ever dabbled in subtlety. He does not dabble in subtlety. And there's no this is that grated. That really did. It was compensated just a bit. At one point in this book, Dan Clifford needs a lawyer, folk. He needs one of them lawyer guys because he's not a lawyer. He's too pure for that. He's a pure-blooded action hero. But at one point he needs a lawyer, and he gets a lawyer named Taft. Stephen Taft. How wonderful. I wanted Stephen Taft to have his own novel. We're told that he has political aspirations. But Ah Sin bugged me. Very much so. The Chinaman, as he's innumerably times called. He bugged me in this book. That struck me as coming closer to the line than I feel comfortable. I don't know much about William MacLeod Rain except for just the bare outline of his story that is often reprinted in his books. So I don't know what he was like in the real world. I don't know if he's just trying to be extra faithful to the attitudes of the time of the book. I don't know, but I trust that I am not being oversensitive on this kind of subject, and that I noticed in this book. So we'll see. We'll see if that crops up again in the next June on the Range, which will be tomorrow. I will pop another novel on the Barbie tonight and continue to overdo it for June on the Range. I don't know if I'll do a book every day in June, but June on the Range is one of the BookTube events I'm doing right now that's limited to 1 month. Dune in June and June on the Range are limited to just the month of June, so I feel like I should get in as many westerns as I can. We'll see. Maybe I'll give William MacLeod Rain another try. That might be good. Back to back with this one to see, if I'm spotting commonalities instead of letting a year go by. I will let you know. Of course, I will read another one and I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.